There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of child sexual abuse. Listener discretion is advised. Launceston is one of Australia's oldest cities. It's the second biggest in Tasmania after Hobart, with a population of about 87,000 people. Walking through the streets of Launceston, it can feel like you're in an early 20th century British town, with Federation-style housing and preserved Victorian and Georgian buildings. Just south of the city centre stands Launceston General Hospital, one of the main public hospitals in the state of Tasmania. The hospital treats 250,000 patients every year, and over 150 years has built trust within the local community. The children's ward is known as Ward 4K, filled with doctors and nurses doing their best to make a child's stay as comfortable as possible. But for more than 20 years, one nurse, a grandfatherly figure to so many, allegedly preyed on sick children. It wasn't until May 2019 when a young woman, referred to as Alice, walked into Launceston Police Station that everything would begin to change. Her story, police would discover, was only the beginning. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is part one in a two-part series. I'm speaking with investigative journalist Camille Bianchi, the creator, host and reporter behind the Nurse podcast. The Nurse is about a man named Jim Griffin who lives in a quiet town in Tasmania and spends his life working with children. He is also hiding a dark secret. How did the case of the nurse come across your desk? I know there's some secrecy around this, but you received a phone call, didn't you?
I did receive a phone call, and unfortunately that's as far as I can go. In that trailer and the intro to which episode, it's exactly how it happened. It was out of the blue, and it certainly isn't my area of expertise, and I'm doing the very best I can, but it was out of the blue. It was a call, and that's all she wrote.
And Jim Griffin had a lot of friends. He was well liked in the community. You speak to a lot of people who knew him very well. How did he come across? Was he charismatic? Was he a family man? Like, what kind of person was he?
So I never met him, but from very, very many accounts, he was a breath of fresh air was one quote. There's a lot of textured responses I'm getting because people feel guilty that they liked him so much. And I think that's why it's so important we don't assume everyone knew, because they very much didn't. He was charismatic, the life of the party, but I'm starting to get a sense that he was very much someone who liked control. He loved to be the authority. He liked to have an enthralled audience. He loved to be around people who perhaps were younger, didn't have as much life experience. Women, we can hazard a guess as to why now with everything in hindsight, but he was, by all accounts, in a lot of ways, a very good nurse, and he made himself indispensable. And it's why it's so important to have these conversations in a podcast medium, because you can provide that nuance and you can say two things can be true. He can have provided a lot of comfort to people in a really tough time and still have had dreadful motivations and, yeah.
He worked at Launceston General Hospital. How old was he approximately during the time he was there? Because he was a little bit older than your average nurse who hadn't had an enormous amount of experience. He'd decided to come to nursing a little bit later, hadn't he?
Yeah, I can tell you exactly. He was born in 1950. So he did his Bachelor of Nursing as a mature age student while working on the university campus, and then he kind of transitioned and stayed there and became a student there. He graduated from there and started on the ward at 48 or 49 years old, and he was 69 years old when he died. So he would have been 49, 50 when he was swinging into the children's ward after he'd done his paediatrics year.
Did he have a family of his own?
Yeah, he was married twice.
Did he have any children?
Yes.
So he starts on this paediatric ward, and there are a few red flags that we learn about in the early episodes in terms of female nurses in particular seeing things that just gave them a gut feeling but might have been difficult to report. What were some of those things, the sort of interactions that he was having with young girls that made people stop and think?
Well, I will say it was actually male nurses and female, because one of the things that people are aware of is how there are many sensitivities around male caregivers, and it's actually the male nurses who can see what they don't do, and they observe what their colleague is doing and they think, oh, that's not something I'd do, carry a patient naked without supervision, things like that. I started to field reports of things that people saw, especially from my earlier sources, saying, you know, I was uncomfortable sometimes. He was, you know, inappropriate, and then, you know, who among us can't be in some of these situations? Nurses go through a lot. But the reports I'm getting that are greater in number are much more blatant than you'd think. And he groomed these people. And I have to start to think of this not so much as a nobody knew or an everybody knew or it's not so much about who knew what. There's lots of shades of grey in the authority level that the people who did see some of the worst things were at, what they were used to, what they were educated by. And we have to acknowledge that a lot of people who didn't report or didn't perhaps push their reports as far as we in hindsight might have liked them to might have been single parents. They might, you know, this is the only game in town. There is one hospital of size in Launceston, and that's really the only avenue for employment for nurses there is the THS. And if you're a troublemaker in the health system, well, then that excludes you from the other hospitals in the state. And it's a small place, Tasmania. But I can, to answer your question, go into some of those examples. So some of the earlier ones were leg rubs, rubbing backs. Some of the freelance nurses, casual nurses, have said to me that they would come in as strangers and go, who's this guy? You know, and, oh, that's just Jim. And, you know, as we've heard, and they're like, oh, so this goes on this ward. Oh, it wouldn't fly anywhere else. And, you know, and there's things like that. There's that level. Sweetheart, darling, taking photos with patients. I consider these mild, but health professionals have told me, no, these aren't just red flags. These are actually reportable as well. So I'm being educated on that myself, especially, as we said, with a male nurse with young women. But some of the more blatant abuses of his privilege in that position were requiring mental health patients to strip in front of him naked and being very angry when he was asked to have any kind of companion. You can require a companion when a child doesn't have a guardian. Some parents chose to sleep on the floor, and they're now calling me and saying, thank God we did, which is, it's not an option for most parents. But, you know, one of them was telling me Jim would get really angry at him because he said, no, I'm sleeping on the floor here, buddy. Anything, you know, you're with my daughter, I'm here. Things like that are more dark that I can go into are the actual molestations. No one has come to me having witnessed that. Unfortunately, people have come to me having experienced that. Not all of whom even wanted to go on the podcast at all, even anonymously, and I respect that. But we have to understand it was many survivors now. And not all survivors. Some of these people that I'm learning about have since passed away through their conditions. You know, there was long-term illness on that ward, and a lot of kids, they're lifers. The hospital's their second home. And one mum put it to me really well. She said, we weren't on the lookout. We weren't looking for red flags. We were looking at and after our dying daughter. That was our focus. It didn't enter our minds that she wasn't safe there.
And when it comes to reporting, you were saying that some of those instances are reportable, whether it's rubbing a back or taking a photo. What are you meant to do? Because I've heard about mandatory reporting, which is in schools and in hospitals where you are legally bound to say what you see. What are nurses meant to do? What's the kind of process in terms of reporting something they see?
There's a number of them, and I won't pretend to be an expert, but I was speaking with a safeguarding specialist recently, and now the advice has changed post-Royal Commission. So in the last few years, it's definitely the advice is if you even get a feeling, it's worth reporting. Inappropriate language around patients. Jim was telling young girls what their boyfriends liked sexually, how to masturbate in a room with other witnesses that, you know, laughed along. You know, things like that we know to make people feel uncomfortable and just to not be okay. So even just having, my understanding is there's differences if you have a male caregiver versus a female one for different genders, is if you're the opposite gender, you always have a companion. I actually think it's the same if you are female and female. My understanding is that there's never a one-on-one interaction which involves sedation or nudity or things like that. So, for example, if we're talking about the prison where he worked as a nurse for short periods, they had a policy, or they should have a policy under national regulations, of never being ungowned completely. So if you do a strip search, in eating disorder patients, unfortunately, there's a lot of issues around, masking their weight. You're not supposed to be nude entirely in front of a practitioner, and you'd always have two, not one, because it's highly sensitive and a vulnerable child. So at the prison, that was not adhered to, I now know, and at least in many instances that are cited with the strip searches. And then with the hospital, certainly there were breaches by Griffin where he was handling patients naked, not giving them the option. And the fact that he was alone with them and saying oh, no, you need to do this, you're not going to refute that. If you have a senior professional in front of you and you're a patient, you're not going to.
It's hard to imagine a situation where someone is more vulnerable. Firstly, being a child, and secondly, when you talk about sedation or surgery or anything to do with health, people are absolutely at their most vulnerable, and there is this implicit trust that we get with caregivers and with nurses because we've got to have that trust. He then, in terms of his relationship with young girls, there's one mention of having travelled overseas with a young girl. What do we know about the way in which he took those relationships outside the hospital?
He was grooming whole families. So he didn't raise alarm bells with a lot of people because he was a family man. He was a volunteer. He was a nurse, which has a high standing in the community, and he was very good at speaking with people, a lot of friends. So what he would do is he would provide all these treats to kids. Their parents might not have been able to afford it in many cases, or they might have thought, thank God someone else is taking an interest in my daughter because I'm a single mum, or whatever it might have been, and there's many of these examples. So he presented it as an opportunity that he could provide, and he was very good at doing that, and he did it over and over.
One woman who you speak to is named Keely, and she was about 7 when she met him for the first time. What were the first signs that he was starting to groom her? When she looks back, her and her mother look back, what were some of the signs they recognised?
Her mother didn't and still doesn't recognise them. And this is something that we've heard from Annette about how terrible she feels. And my heart goes out to her because it's no one's fault but the perpetrator. And for all the parents that have been in touch with me since, from the hospital, from everywhere else, no, it is no one's fault but Jim's. What Keely noticed was positive through the framing of a 14-year-old girl's eyes when it really started was compliments, calling her a special girl, back rubs, lingering hugs, a lot of attention. And other survivors have told me the same thing, is he started to pay them more attention. And he had replica cases of the women I've spoken with. He did this over decades and decades, where he had form for doing the same thing and in very similar ways. And for teenage girls, I think particularly a bit younger teenage, you might not be the centre of attention all the time. You might feel like, I kind of feel a bit special. I like this. And that's what becomes so complicated in hindsight. And that's why there's so much fractured trauma from some of the people speaking with me now, is it felt good at the time, and then that's something else to reconcile.
How did it eventually escalate? Because Annette was a friend of Jim's from the hospital, and so they became sort of family friends. So he had this access to a child that he might not have otherwise. How did that escalate with Keely into something that was criminal?
He approached her at a sleepover that he had at his house. By that stage, he had years of trust built. 7 years of trust. It's how he operated. And he approached her and molested her. And it was dark, it was late, and he acted, importantly, it escalated in that moment, and again 6 months later he did the same thing. But it was his reaction that was what informed her response. And she felt like nothing had happened, and I think she's put it so well. She said, either I felt like nothing had happened or that it wasn't important that it did. Because the next morning he was like, oh, want breakfast, want coffee? And she was like, but this is Jim. This is, we love Jim. Our family loves Jim. This is a friend, especially at that age, or any of us, in a moment to be betrayed like that and violated. It doesn't compute for a long time. And her response was to isolate herself and to avoid him and to have a lot of anger and confusion around that. But it's textbook with a lot of what this guy did.
And she didn't want to tell her mother for obvious reasons. And there's this friendship that she almost didn't want to get in the way of, and she's confused about her own experience. And then another woman came forward who I think goes by the pseudonym Alice. And she walked into the police station and made a report. What did she tell them?
So Alice is a hero. So she chose not to be involved with this, but I have the utmost respect for her. She is the reason this is all happening. She was brave enough to come forward. The charge is now called persistent sexual abuse of a minor. She was groomed and abused for years at the highest level from the age of 11. And she came forward in May 2019 and brought those charges. And I know to be true that all other of the very brave women, the 5 women in total, so 4 others, chose to come forward because of her. And they heard and they went, you know what? Someone else will believe me. And the risk she took in a small community and to do that, I can't even imagine it.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Camille Bianchi, investigative journalist and host of the Nurse podcast about the alleged crimes of Jim Griffin. You've uncovered that there is a document that you can't get your hands on at this point, which has filed 101 complaints. You're trying to get it. What do you think is in there? From the research that you've done, what have you sort of uncovered about the complaints that were made against this nurse?
So I went into asking for that. I put an RTI, which is like a Freedom of Information request in Tassie. I put that in the 1st of April, and that was after I'd kind of had an idea of what some of those things would be, which were serious complaints filed against James Griffin years before he was arrested and charged with offences against children. So that schedule of documents, which includes complaints and then correspondence about him, that I can't speak to all of it, but what I expect to find now is a couple of serious incidents that were filed, and I expect to find that they were filed under a lower ranking than they should have been, because I now know that the hospital management has confirmed in writing that the complaints it did receive and was aware of prior to 2019 were not enough to raise alarm bells. So either they have a very interesting way of classifying what should raise alarm bells, or someone amended those files. Either could be true at this point, and I think they're incredibly, incredibly important questions to ask. So one of those complaints was that he was teaching a room full of young women with eating, or girls with eating disorders on the ward, about what men liked sexually, talking about oral sex, stimulation, all that stuff, incredibly inappropriate. The other complaints were we heard 10 years ago a complaint was made to HR that he had molested this girl from the age of 8 hundreds of times, and there were grave concerns about his ability to be around children. There are other complaints that I don't know if they were ever filed. There are many. So there are others, including that he joked with a patient, I think it was in 2019, that he'd given her a date rape drug, and he said that in front of the parents. One of the funniest ones is someone said, yeah, I complained about Jim, but more because he was a dick.
And he really was.
Oh, he was pretty good at keeping his P's and Q's with patients, I think, on the ward. But this was very funny to me because this parent was super protective, and we heard that Jim got really angry about that. So
how did Jim know? Because from what, and I'm not an expert in this either, but I would imagine that when you file a complaint, there's some sort of confidentiality, or there's, a pretty strict process in order to investigate it and not have any blowback. Were the complaints treated with respect in that way?
Oh, I have no reason to think there was any process that was adhered to. Look, I can't speak to all the complaints. I'd be really extending myself too much, but I know that many of them weren't. I know that, we've heard from Lorna, a name I made up, from a nurse who she filed for leave, and her leave request was granted, but they refused to commit to paper the reason she was going on leave, which was that she was traumatised by the handling or lack of handling of complaints about Jim. And this is after he passed away and everything came out. So respect, it's an interesting question. I have no reason to think that there was.
We know that anyone who works with children is subject to a pretty intense working with children check, and that's teachers, nurses, anything from coaching. How does a man who has a history of complaints, which we'll go more into, end up allowed to work with children up until very, very recently?
Oh, that's $1 million question. So the history of complaints was what was in doubt when I began this story, or at least on paper. So what I now know is that there was receipt of a complaint formally before Jim was granted his working with children card in 2016. Let's not even go into how he was on the ward without vulnerable people accreditation for 15 years, including at a sporting club. Before that was happened, there's quirks of Tasmanian law that I can't fathom. So there is that, and I don't know. The rest has to be the subject of an investigation, and I'm cautiously optimistic that the independent investigation announced by the Tasmanian government will do its job. We have to at least be optimistic, but we also have to hold it to account.
So you began this with a handful of stories of the women who had come forward. How many at this point, roughly, accounts of sexual abuse have you encountered?
I can only speak to what I've personally encountered, dozens. So they're not all represented in the podcast. I should say this, not everyone should report. I know we talk about that or rather speak out about their own abuse. And I know we rightly, worship the ones who do because they're so brave and they're taking on so much. But it can do a lot of trauma and harm. We even know the court process is so harmful in a lot of cases. We don't do right by survivors, and until we do, we can't expect or ask them all to come forward. Some told me their abuse, I'm the first and only person they've ever told, which is a privilege, but it's frustrating because they're not an environment in which they feel safe enough to do so and that they would have any kind of justice, I suppose. So I would number it around 28, 30 of personal, verifiable abuses that I've been informed of.
And let's remember too that this was on a ward where people were seriously ill. So there would have been people who haven't survived and therefore their stories have disappeared. There's also allegations of drugging children. What has come out about that, and is it possible that there were victims that do not recall what happened to them?
Yeah, it's a question that people have approached me with, so families particularly who have children who are or were patients on 4K. They don't know. And they're asking me, and it's heartbreaking. I can't possibly answer that. And I'm not an alarmist. I don't want to say anyone who encountered this person who was sedated for procedures or for anything like that was molested or harmed. But the fact that I can't reassure them and that by all accounts the hospital can't is so incredibly distressing. So absolutely, I've heard a lot about medications going missing, reports of patients under his watch that went up to surgery without sufficient anaesthesia. There's a lot of that. It's mounting up. So yeah, that's about as much as I can say is just a lot of reports.
When police searched his house, they found some pretty damning evidence on electronic devices. What did they find, and was he ever charged for them?
Yes, he was. So he was charged for some of them. So he was charged for child exploitation offences, including what we now know to be many, many pictures of patients on the ward, which is a mystery I'm still tapping away at in terms of what's been done since in the reporting process. So police uncovered those on his mobile device. On his laptop, they also found he had been in a forum where he uploaded imagery and video of him abusing a child, a girl, and that was something he bragged about in this forum. And he said in the forum, I drugged her. This is how I did it. So he has people who, sickeningly, would have clearly welcomed that image and that explanation, and working out who they are it's not my realm, and I'm not qualified, I'm not a policeman, but we now know that there's ongoing operations that in recent days even have been uncovering some child exploitation material uploads and things in all states across Australia. I don't know who those people would have been, but he was charged for that. And then there are a number of charges on the coroner's report that were being investigated, so they were never filed. So police were potentially about to lay a number of other charges that he died and they could never lay.
Have the people who were depicted in those videos and pictures been notified of their existence?
My understanding is from that forum incident, and that was in 2015 that he did that, yes. I just don't know as to, particularly speaking about the hospital patients whose images were taken, I have at this point, no confirmation or evidence that actually did happen. I'm told by police it was an expectation of the hospital that they would consult with all those people. I know the nurses tried to form a committee of sorts to sensitively examine those and identify patients because they know they're patients. That committee was never formed. It was rejected by hospital management. What hospital management since did, I don't know. They haven't answered that question of mine, and they haven't answered it in writing to staff.
Camille Bianchi is the investigator and host behind The Nurse, which you can find in any podcast app. You can also find a link in our show notes below. If you have any tips or information, you can contact Camille at thenursepodcast@gmail.com. This was part 1 of a 2-part series. Tune in next week for the second half of my interview with Camille. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our executive producer is Zoe Ferguson, with sound design by Ian Camilleri. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.